Hi guys, this is just going to be a brief video that kind of ties into our next major writing project. So today we're going to be talking just a little bit about primary research, conducting your interview, because interviews are a form of primary research and 1010 focuses on primary research. And so we're just going to briefly go over what that is, some tips for your interview, and just some advice from your book. So primary versus secondary research. A lot of you have already studied this, so I'm not going to go too much in depth in it because it's a really simple definition. Primary research is research that you have conducted yourself. So it can include interviews, personal observations, and experiments you completed and reported on the outcome. So it's things that you have done or witnessed. So primary, it's like one. Secondary research is research that has been done by others that you are kind of reporting on and using as a source, such as anybody else's research, news articles, textbooks, academic papers. Those were things that other people have done, and you were just telling what happened. So for this, you are going to be conducting an interview. You are going to be the one gathering the information, so it's going to be a primary source. So there are some things to consider as you start this process. One, interview someone you feel comfortable interviewing. Like, don't go out and try to interview a complete stranger. Someone that you can have an easy conversation with. I've had students do siblings in the past, which has worked out really, really well. They said they actually learned something new about their brother or sister that they didn't know before. Parents are great to use for this. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, a favorite teacher. A friend. You can interview a friend for this, and that will be perfectly fine. Come up with some open-ended questions to foster conversation, and I'm going to be going over some examples of those in just a minute. Be respectful of your interviewee. Don't purposely ask questions that could potentially embarrass them or kind of put them on the spot. You also want to be respectful of their time. So you don't want to come at them with like 50 million questions and they feel a little bit overwhelmed. Try to keep the questions to, just enough information to where you can construct this profile and without it being like a 5-hour interview. So, but speaking of that, be prepared to allow the interview to go in a different direction. So don't be so set on your questions that if one question tends to, kind of lead to another that in a direction that you weren't prepared for, don't be afraid to explore that for a little bit. But at the same time, don't forget, you're over your goal, like your end goal, bring it back eventually. But sometimes, especially with the older generation, it can, you can find out the most amazing stories. Prime example of this is my husband did a very similar project to this when he was in high school, and he interviewed his grandfather. And his grandfather led this fascinating life. He was a cowboy in Texas and herded cows he was just a fascinating man, and he always had the best stories about his childhood. Like one time he caught cockroaches for this man to use for fishing, but then he accidentally knocked over the cockroach jar in a general store, and the store got so infested it had to close. And that came up during this interview process. And so sometimes, allow a story to go on, and might lead to another one that's absolutely fascinating that you would actually want to use in your story. And so don't be afraid of that. But also allow yourself enough time to do the interview and construct your project. Interview projects are all about time management. So you want to make sure that one, you're figuring out who you want to interview fairly quickly, conducting that interview, and then giving yourself enough time to construct what you came up with. So open-ended questions. So you don't want questions that could lead to just a yes or no answer. You want questions that will foster conversation. So it's things like, tell me about your greatest accomplishment versus have you accomplished anything you're proud of? With the second example, I could go, yeah, I wrote an article for a magazine one time. And that's about it. But tell me about your greatest accomplishment. That tends to foster a little bit more conversation. What was it like growing up in the 1980s versus was the 1980s really like Stranger Things? No, it wasn't. I grew up in the 80s. There are some elements of it, but a better question would be, what was it like? How did you decide on your college versus what college did you attend? I attended Tennessee Tech. Well, with the first question, it could be more along the lines of, well, I decided to go to Tennessee Tech because my brother was going there and I was visiting a lot and I fell in love with the campus. So much better answer. How did you develop your relationship with your spouse? That's a really fun one. Versus, was it love at first sight? For me, no, I liked him at first sight. But asking me how to develop that relationship would just lead to more conversation. What do you feel is the secret to happiness versus are you happy? And what is the best piece of advice ever given to you versus were you given good life advice? These are just examples. I want you to come up with your own questions, but I just want to give you an idea of what an open-ended question looks like versus one that will just give you that really simple yes or no answer. So, part of doing these interviews, so for this week, I asked you to kind of look over these chapters about annotation and summarization. So, chapter 7 in your book is all about annotating and summarizing your sources. In this case, it's your interviewee. So before you even get started, take a moment to consider what you know about your interviewee and what you would like to know. Make note of your reactions during the interview. Was like there's something that just completely surprised you or shocked you or something that you weren't expecting. So make sure you're kind of taking your own notes and kind of annotating your reactions during the time. Don't just listen. Like if you're doing these interviews, you need to record it somehow. You can do it by writing notes, using the recording function on your phone, or even conducting it over email if that's going to be the best choice for someone who's really busy, like if you're picking someone outside your family. And then after the interview is over, go back and make notes on the things you want to include on your project. And you can do this either directly, like if you have handwritten notes, you can go through there and just highlight maybe the things that you would like to include. If it's recorded, maybe go back and listen to it and make physical notes saying, okay, at the 5-minute mark, I definitely want to include the story that they told at the 5-minute mark in this project. So in this project, you don't have to use direct quotes. You can if you want to, though. You can summarize. So summarizing is taking a longer passage and breaking it down into a smaller one. So this is just an example. I remember my parents would let us roam free in the 1980s. They would kick us out shortly after breakfast, and sometimes I wouldn't see them again until the street lights came back on. We drank from hose pipes when we were thirsty, and lunches were at whoever's house we were closest to. Let's say you want to use that, but you don't necessarily want to use that much information. So it can become, as a child, he roamed the streets with his friends from morning to night and grabbed a drink from the hose and at lunch whoever's house he happened to be at. Perfectly fine. Not the most grammatically perfect sentence, but as I said, this is another one of those projects where we're going to be concentrating on content. But yeah, you don't have to like do direct quotes for every single little thing. You can summarize what they are saying. So choosing your genre that you're going to be using, you have the freedom to construct it in whatever you want, but you also have to think about what genre would serve your purpose best. So your audience is an audience of your peers, so think about what they would like to experience. Your purpose is to share your interviewee's life with your peers, and how would you best accomplish that? Do you have enough time to construct your genre? So for this, remember, you do not have to write a paper. I'm giving you a lot of freedom. You can do a one-pager, you can do PowerPoint, a Prezi. You know, the door is pretty wide open on this. And what's really cool is if you decide to do something like a PowerPoint or a Prezi or whatnot, you can add pictures. But two, if you decide that you want to write the paper, like construct a regular written paper, you can include pictures in that too. It doesn't have to just be written words. It can be something known as multimodal, which means it has more than one genre in there. So like if you have, like let's say you do interview your grandfather and you have a great picture of him, you feel free to include that in your paper if you decide to actually write it out. I want you to be creative with this. I want you to have fun with it. I want it to be not overly stressful. So please feel free to do whatever you would like to do. And that is it. We will be discussing this in depth in class. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, please just let me know.